I am very glad to be talking with my fellow Hearst author, James Harpur. Hi there, James.
Hi there, Mark. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. We've got together because we've both published books in recent weeks and months that are either about a mystic, in my case, or mystics, in James's case. So let me show you James's book, this wonderful book, Dazzling Darkness, which covers over 70 mystics, actually, and asks, well, maybe I won't say quite what it asks, because we're going to talk about that in our conversation right now, but much to be recommended if you're at all interested in these things, which I guess you are, which is because why you're listening now. But James, I've published a book too.
Yeah. Well, as it happens, I happen to have a copy of your book too. I have to say, seriously, it was a wonderful read. Blake's not an easy character to get your head round, and your book does get your head round it very well. The poetry and the imagination and the life, and beautifully illustrated as well. I won't flick to all the colour plates that are in it, but William Blake's paintings are wonderful, and this book does them full justice, so congratulations.
Yeah, well, thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah. Hey, look, I tackle one, you tackle 70.
Yeah.
Why did you want to do that? The book is subtitled The Lives and Afterlives of the Christian Mystics. So that's beginning to give us a clue. But, maybe why personally as well as why publicly?
Well, I didn't think I'd be writing a book on mystics when I did write it, which the seeds of it were a long time ago. But it was born out of an experience I had, a personal experience, going back a few decades, when I was lying in bed with a debilitating injury, my back, and feeling very depressed. And to cut a long story short, I began to meditate at a time when I hadn't meditated before and wasn't realizing that I was meditating. I was simply lying on my back and staring at the ceiling and feeling sorry for myself. And I began to read various books, including T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ, the Dhammapada and the Bhagavad Gita. Those are four I remember. There were others too. And very gradually, I remember through meditation, reading, and prayer, I began to feel more serene and peaceful over days and over weeks. And this increased in intensity until I began to feel as if all my problems and cares were sort of melting away. And then one morning, I had this extraordinary implosion of light. And I felt as if my body had disintegrated into light, and my mind too, as if I was just a being of light, and a sense of fantastic blissfulness and joy and love. Completely unexpected. I had no idea it was going to happen. And there was a part, I felt as if my consciousness was evaporating, that my ego consciousness was evaporating. And there was just a tiny bit of it left, just enough to give me the anxiety that I was going to die. Either die or go mad, or not be the same person as I was. And this was just enough to bring me out of this ecstatic condition. And so I returned, as it were, to normal ego consciousness. But for the next, I'd say 6 months, I was a changed person. I still am, actually, compared to what I was, which was basically a selfish young man. And after about 6 months, it began to wear off. I began to be more integrated into urban life. I moved up to London. I was living in Wiltshire with my mum. And just the wears and, the wear and tear of everyday life sort of eroded the sense of peacefulness I had. But for those 6 months, I felt an extraordinary joy and love for everyone and everything. Again, completely unexpected and against my natural selfish character before then. And I think it was after that I had the sense that I'd be able to get back into that state of blissfulness. And so I was meditating consciously, not unwittingly as before. And I wasn't able to get back to that sense of ecstasy and bliss. So I began to wonder what it was I'd gone through, and I just began to read and investigate and explore other people who'd been through this, and it led me naturally onto the path of the mystics. And I was just curious to see which one of them, or if all of them, had experienced something similar and how they had expressed it, because it's so difficult to write about. And I've tried to do so. By vocation, I'm a poet, and I have actually tried to write up this experience in various ways. So that's what led me, Mark, to the book. It was a systematic approach of trying to find someone I could identify with, really. And eventually I put my explorations into note form, and it turned into a book. So it's not an academic treatise. It's really a book designed for fellow explorers and questers into, I suppose you'd say, ultimate truth or God or reality. So that's the sort of the shortest answer I can give.
Well, it's a very wonderful answer in a number of ways, of course, and I love the way that you frame the book with your personal story, because it makes present what you then go on to discuss and explore. It gives it that sense that this really matters,
Yeah.
and I think that's what I value about the mystics and their
Yes.
writings. Yeah.
Well, you must tell me how you got into William Blake, because I know from your background you're a Jungian psychotherapist, and you've been a priest. So obviously Blake must have been around your fringes. But to dedicate the time and the effort and the skill to write a book on Blake is a different order of events. So what made you take the plunge?
I mean, I've never had a sustained ecstatic experience like you describe, if ecstatic's the right word, but nonetheless have quite a sustained contemplative practice that's developed over the years, but has settled for quite a number of years now into a broadly theistic kind of practice. The book I actually use at the core of it is The Cloud of Unknowing. And so that has a particular strand of apophatic, as it's called, spirituality.
Yes.
Now, Blake is actually very different from that, I think. If anything, he would be in the cataphatic category. For him, world is seen in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower, whereas the Cloud of Unknowing is very much about putting to one side all that one knows, in inverted commas, and by that he means, all thoughts and feelings and so on. That goes into what he calls the cloud of forgetting, and then sitting with this dart of longing love, this simple yearning for the divine, that is wholly other and yet can be reached out to through love. So my practice and Blake's experience in life seem quite different. But I think that they're actually a bit like a heartbeat, the kind of withdrawal into the negative space to perceive the divine, and then the return in the fullness of life, seeing the divine present in the minute particulars, as Blake puts it, that little bit more. But Blake's also fascinating because I think it's right to call him a mystic. I really do, and a Christian mystic very much too, although influenced by other traditions, not least the Bhagavad Gita there that you mentioned. But he didn't have, I don't think, a kind of elated experience in life, or an experience of sustained bliss. He quite often talks actually about his nervous fear. And I imagine that if you met Blake, you might meet quite a different character on the surface in the times you met him, but there would always be a sense of depth or presence, I think, coming through. And so that sort of in between kind of spirituality really intrigues me. A kind of almost every day that has its ups and downs. You know, Blake writes, "Man was made for joy and woe, and when this we rightly know, through the world we safely go." So in terms of feelings and happiness, that's going to change. And yet there's a rootedness that I think Blake did come to by the end of his life, actually. The reports when he was in his 60s, the last 5 to 10 years of his life, suggest that there was a kind of tranquility, a peace that passes understanding that he knew then.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing is just that Blake, I live in South London, Blake is kind of our local mystic. And I found it very helpful to be in the place where the mystic is or was.
Yeah.
That actually helps open it up somehow. I don't wholly understand, but there's something about sharing the same sort of psychogeography, even when it's overlaid as it much is in London, of course. But
Yeah.
you know, I wanted both to learn about Blake from this place, but also myself to be in this place in a different way, informed by Blake. And yeah, so that's something of you know, what I feel. You know, I have discovered and continue to discover. I think, I don't know whether you feel this, but I feel that certainly Blake is one of these figures that if you're going to write about them, you have to be prepared to sort of be changed by them.
Yeah.
And maybe that's partly why you returning to the mystics, to see, you know, who would ask you to change.
Yes. Well, I think almost all of them would really, especially since I'm sort of a lapse from my state of blissfulness and return to ordinary person. But I think, yeah, of all the mystics, I suppose, I don't know, I have a feel for Saint Columba, who set up shop in Iona. He was kind of exiled from London, from Ireland, and he founded a monastery on the island of Iona, where the Book of Kells was probably started in about 800. But what I like about him, and the way in which I think he changes me or tries to change me, was that he was typical of a type of Irish pilgrim called the peregrinus, who was unusual in that, unlike other later medieval pilgrims who had places to go to, like Jerusalem and Rome, the Irish peregrini had set off on journeys without any goals. So they would set out in a boat without oars and let the wind blow them to wherever the wind would take them. And there's a famous instance in 891, written up in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, of 3 Irishmen landing on the coast of Cornwall, and the Cornish locals were amazed to find that the boat had a sail but no oars, and the 3 Irish monks had provisions for 7 days, and they declared to the Cornishmen that they were sailing for the love of Christ and knew not where they were going, quote. And so the idea was that you let Providence guide you to wherever it was Providence wanted you to go, and you made the best of it. And we don't know how many peregrini actually perished on the seas, but for me, this is a wonderful ideal of letting yourself go. You need a huge amount of faith to do this. And in our age of sat-nav and of absolute control over physical direction, of trying to control our lives minutely, which is one of my faults. If I'm going to a new town, I Google Earth it to death to find the car park and the one-way streets and everything. But this idea of letting yourself go with the wind, and the wind wasn't just a meteorological thing. It was, it was the Holy Spirit. It was the breath of God. So you weren't sort of taking pot luck. You were trusting a providential process. And Columba himself did have mystical experiences. He was seen to be surrounded by angels on one occasion, and on another occasion, a passing monk saw his oratory filled with light, and an unearthly light coming from his prayer. And it was said that Columba's 5 fingers glowed like candles when he wrote. So he was clearly a man of numinosity. But it's that idea of casting yourself off and trusting God, which I find very inspiring, and which I think challenges me on a daily basis of just trying to let go and being more trusting.
Yeah, and I can share that tendency to want to control. Often for me, it's about wanting to understand, and I feel like the practice, the Cloud of Unknowing, it can sound a bit, I don't know, dramatic to put it this way, but at its best, in moments at least, it is a kind of practice of dying,
Yes.
or at least readying for dying, and that, I think, that letting go in order to let in the divine, is, these things are very kind of interlinked, but it's also, I guess, about trying to follow my love for God as kind of clearly as possible, if you like, by which I mean sort of simply in the sense of, it almost feels like that love is a kind of holding, and that, but a readying for kind of grace or whatever may come in, to use the Christian words, but also, if it's a holding, it's also, you, again, one hardly dare say it, but again, occasionally the sense that it's not me that's loving God, but that somehow the divine is the love within me. And I get glimpses of what St. Paul might have meant when he talked about how, the Spirit groaning within the whole of creation, actually, but also within oneself. So that kind of, I guess that's very interior compared to the uncreated light of Columba that you're talking about there. But I believe it, because I can see how in a life where that was intensified, why wouldn't it glow in a way? And particularly in a time when I think people were probably quite naturally more porous, simply because they didn't live in such a very thoroughly shaped human environment.
Yes.
You just couldn't live in such a cocooned way as we do. You're nodding. That makes some sense to you.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's right. I think we've got no idea of what it was like to live in a time before the internet, let alone 100 years ago. We're so used to our phones and technology that a life of Columba is unimaginable. And I remember this particularly during COVID, right at the start of COVID, when there was the shutdown, where certainly I live in Ireland. I'm not sure if you knew that. I live in West Cork, in the middle of nowhere. And we weren't allowed to move more than 3 kilometers, I think, at first. And, there was no traffic, no aeroplanes, nothing. And it felt as if we were getting back to a sort of a Columban reality somehow. Everyone was walking. You could hear the birds more clearly than before. And it was a different type of reality. And I remember, I think I wrote an essay, which I didn't publish, on how a Columban existence could actually help us through COVID, because at that stage there was no indication how long it would last for. But yeah, he's certainly a key character. in my pantheon of mystics.
I mean, another figure who's very important to me, he wouldn't really be called a mystic, but I think he understood the nature of consciousness and different kinds of consciousness, is Owen Barfield.
Oh,
And he
yeah.
was one of the inklings, you know, alongside Lewis and Tolkien. But he felt that words can be what he called fossils of consciousness. And you mentioned just there that the wind was also the breath and the spirit.
Yeah.
And they were sailing with the spirit across the water. And that was a key example for Barfield, actually, of how consciousness can shift. That now when you come across the Greek word pneuma, for example, you know, in the New Testament, you have to decide how you're going to translate it, wind, breath, or spirit. And that immediately is to move into a different, it's already to be in a different kind of consciousness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, but maybe COVID on one level was a very dramatic thing, of course, and the lockdowns too. But on the other hand, maybe it doesn't take that much to shift back. And you reminded me of pilgrimage, of course, when you were talking, that is becoming very, very popular now. And I think that, again, by sort of just reducing your hold on life by stepping out on a pilgrimage, even with a destination in mind, it is amazing quite how quickly the birds start to sing more brightly, and you know you feel really quite different being in the world.
Yeah, that's very true. You're right about pilgrimage being a growth activity. The Camino is hugely popular, almost too popular now, I suspect. But even local shrines like Walsingham have become more popular, and it can only be a good thing. And I think that's, going to spirituality in general, I think pilgrimage, along with the retreat movement, there are more and more Christian houses opening up to outsiders coming in for retreats and prayer groups as well. So there is a way of getting back to a Columban sensibility if you look for it. And I think because the digital world that we're being increasingly subjected to is such that I think people are making more of an effort to seek the polar opposite. You know, to go from screens to paper, for example. So we shall all end up as medieval mystics in the end.
Well, so that's another element that I wanted to raise with you, because, of course, I mean, we're just meeting, but you live in Ireland. You've said that, but I don't think you live as a monk in Ireland, for example, and I don't live as a monk in South London. And this is a kind of difference, that people like us are writing about these mystics, when it wouldn't be so long ago that it would only be other mystics that would write about mystics. So there is a kind of new experiment going on with mysticism. And I was curious about how you sense, I don't know if this is quite the right question, but that mysticism is playing out today. If there is an interest demonstrated in things like pilgrimage, you know, what's this mysticism looking like? Or how is it a counterpoint to life? Do you have a sense of that at all?
I'm not sure. In one sense, it's not playing out at all. But I speak from an Irish perspective, really, because the church has had a fearful battering in the last 20 to 30 years. That a lot of I get the sense that the prevailing intelligentsia are throwing out the baby with the bathwater, and anything that smacks of God or religion, apart from in very rural areas, tends to be looked on with skepticism, shall we say. And certainly in poetry circles, which I suppose I know best, there are very few poets writing on spiritual subjects. I can only think of 3, in fact, out of 150. So that has changed. Whereas, before 1950, almost every poet, well, let's say before 1920, almost every poet had a spiritual or religious sensibility, all the great poets anyway. So in that sense, I think mysticism isn't playing out at that level. On the other hand, there was an article in the Irish Times some years ago saying that whereas Christianity in Ireland was diminishing, or not just in Ireland, that the rise in sort of I think he cited shops with money frogs and astrology charts and incense and candles, things associated with the New Age, were on the increase. So that it was. He asked the question, is the church failing its congregations by being too outward and not mystical or spiritual enough? And although there are kind of counter movements like the Teresa movement, which I think tries to get back to an original spirituality, I'm not sure. I haven't got my finger on the pulse of the Church of England, but certainly I think the churches here probably don't embrace the mystical or the spiritual, unless it's special kind of prayer groups, Julian prayer groups or whatever. But it's not part of the mainstream, I don't think. But I'm not sure mysticism ever was part of the mainstream. I mean, Meister Eckhart was on heresy charges. Marguerite Porete was burned at the stake in 1310 for believing that, her rallying cry was that without a will, you cannot sin, because without a will, if you have the will of Christ in you, you can't imagine Christ sinning, which is, a debatable point, I suppose, but not worthy of being burnt at the stake. So I think, in a way, it's the fate of the mystic always to be on the fringes. And I'm not sure I would want it otherwise, Mark. I can't imagine Blake, being... Well, I think you say in your book he was too religious to go to church. And that's kind of the way I like him, because we all like renegades and mavericks, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. You're pointing there to, a long-standing tradition. Maybe it's even in the New Testament itself, where the mystic is not completely disconnected from the church, but is certainly tracking a path that may sometimes be parallel, but may at other times not be. I mean, Margaret Porete, she's been associated at least with the Brethren of the Free Spirit, and then Teresa of Avila, another great mystic, had to write her biography for the Inquisition. Great for us because we now have her autobiography, but and she too was. It often seems that silence is where people get wary. So Teresa of Avila practices these silent techniques that came from books that were banned by the church, in fact, and this sort of maybe sense that it's both well-meaning but also misplaced, that people need to be careful if they go off on their own into their inner life. And I do think there's some sense in that, actually, but it can easily flip into a claim that the individual needs the priest and that God only comes through the mediations of the church. So, in particularly in monastic traditions, I guess, you do find this tension. Now, the monastic traditions can get very powerful too. The Benedictines did, and the Dominicans did, and that they suffer from their own flaws. There's nothing perfect in this life, but nonetheless, I think I'm with you, actually. I think of Blake as a kind of rebel, but not actually as a heretic. He's often called, at least, unorthodox. But I think actually that for the mystic, it's seeking what they feel is the greatest truth, that often drives the mystic, even if subsequently that looks like it's, taken a wrong path. But I think that it's wrong to the protester or the activist, seeks to just challenge the church or knock the church, and there's often good reason for doing that, like you're saying, has been so evident in Ireland. But I think that pursuing what they feel to be the closest path to God is what the mystic on the whole seeks, and that's why I make this slightly quip, this quip about Blake being too religious to go to church, because I think that the Church of England, in a way, is now suffering for what it enjoyed in Blake's time in Georgian England, which had this extraordinary place and prestige in civil society. You basically couldn't do anything like become a university lecturer or civil servant or something, let alone get baptized or married, without the Church of England's involvement.
Yeah.
And I think that at some level, the pushback from that is partly responsible for the Church of England's decline now. People somehow sense that, it's in the fact that people, not only is mysticism typically not present in the Church of England, but the wider populace would never think, I think, to consult the Church of England about mysticism either.
No, I think you're right there, and the alternatives aren't obvious really. If you can't go to your local priest for advice on mystical experiences or writings, then it's hard to know where to go.
I do have a spiritual director. I don't know whether that's a tradition that you come across, but there are good trainings, by which I mean they're a bit like psychotherapy trainings. They're formative. They're actual processes that you undergo. And so I do have a spiritual director, and that has, and I've been seeing him for about once every 2 or 3 months,
Right.
for about, I don't know, maybe 15 years or something now. And it's a good thing, because you get a chance to reflect or advice even with what's present there and then, but also there is a sort of sense of where you've come from and how things do change. So I do actually, I don't want to go completely sort of off piste. I do think that some sort of dialogue with someone, and then of course you have your guides. You've got many guides, probably like Saint Columba, but and I've written about Blake and about Dante, and I feel that they very much informed my kind of imagination.
Yes.
Even though I have this quite ascetic practice.
Yes. My spiritual director is someone called J. Krishnamurti, who's
Okay.
passed away in 1986, but I don't know if you've come across him at all. He's an Indian-born spiritual speaker. Do you know him? I
certainly do. Yeah, I mean, I know something of his story with the Theosophist. I mean, partly because Owen Barfield was associated with the Anthroposophists, and the Anthroposophists split from the Theosophists over Krishnamurti. And I've been to Chennai in India and seen, where the center is there and so on. And so I mean, I couldn't say I follow him closely, but I certainly have enough sense to respect him greatly. I mean, one thing, apropos what we were talking about control, which I think is marvelous, I believe that he was close to dying, and his followers said, have you got one last piece of wisdom to offer? You can correct me if this is actually apocryphal or not, but I do like it. He said, yes, that my last piece of wisdom is that I don't mind what happens. And this very sort of simple comment, but it sort of struck me in the moment when I heard this, that, gosh, if you could really say that, then you would be living a different kind of life.
When you say he didn't mind what happened, what referring to his body?
I guess that, yeah. I mean, I think he was.
I
don't know if he was actually dying or.
There was talk about cremation or burial, or what they should do, where he would want to be buried or cremated. I think by that stage, he didn't really mind.
So it was as much a practical comment as it was a spiritual comment.
I'm not sure. Yes, I'm not sure of the
Yeah.
context.
And but say, how did you discover Krishnamurti, and how does he speak to you?
It was after I mentioned at the start my sort of spiritual awakening, I suppose, and when the sense of blissfulness wore off, and I returned to my old self. I sort of I've always had a spiritual streak. It's in my family. My family have a long line of Church of Ireland ministers in them, and I thought I'd give Christianity a real go. And so I was working in Piccadilly. In fact, I used to go to St James's Church, which you know all too well, and I sort of, I went to church services and I really prayed. I went on my knees and I did the whole thing as sort of thoroughly and devoutly as I could. And I just didn't feel anything. I couldn't really get an emotional experience from it. And then I moved flats to one in Hammersmith, and my flatmate and I were talking about the nature of love one night in all its aspects. And a couple of days later, she gave me this book, which was the first Krishnamurti reader. And I had a sort of revelation, really, I suppose. Every page seemed to be as if there were thoughts I had, but he'd articulated them perfectly. And what I liked about him was that he writes about or speaks about. He doesn't actually write very much. Most of his books are transcripts of his talks. He talks about everyday things like jealousy and loneliness and anger, and just asks, what can we do about it? What's the way forward? So he's very practical. He's very existential in a everyday way. So that's what immediately appealed to me. But then he goes into other aspects of life and spirituality, like the whole problem with the self, which almost every mystic I've come across goes into. The idea of that the foundation of mysticism is humility, which implies the loss of ego, the loss of self. That the less you are filled with self, the more you can be filled with God. It's like a sort of a bucket, if you like, and the being humble allows the ego to drift away, and it just creates a space for God. And Krishnamurti is very persuasive on the nature of the self, and the idea that if you try to be humble, you can't be, because you're mobilizing your ego to do the thing that it shouldn't be doing. So you're kind of stuck in a bind. You want to be humble because that's the way forward to a mystical experience, but you can't try to be humble. So what can you do? Well, Krishnamurti suggests that you just have to. I'm simplifying, but you observe your lack of humility, which happens all the time, and you don't judge it or do anything with it. You just observe it. And it's his contention that the observation has a transformatory effect. And I found that when I read that, I thought, of course, that's the only way you can do it. You can only just observe. As soon as you act upon it, then you're mobilizing your ego, and you're stuck in the whole cycle of wanting, which is an ego verb. Anyway, so that was basically how I got into Krishnamurti, and I managed to go and see him speak just before he died a couple of times. He died, as I say, in 1986, and he used to give talks every year at Brockwood in Hampshire, and I managed to see him a couple of times, and I've kind of stuck with him ever since. Really, he was a particular consolation during during COVID. And I found rereading the Gospels in light of Krishnamurti fascinating, trying to visualize Jesus as in terms of Krishnamurti's words. And that was very, very interesting. There are a lot of parallels which may not be obvious, in the first instance.
I think the perennial, well, sometimes truths, like say expressed in notions like humility, but the perennial presence. I feel. I mean, I'm Christian, but the most regular place for silence that I go to is actually a Buddhist place, just because the Buddhists know how to do silence. But I go to India, and I particularly would be associated with a couple of the ashrams there, Ramana Maharshi's ashram, and then also an ashram outside Vellore, called Sri Puram. But I think that these other traditions speak to my core tradition and help me tune into what's present there. So hence Dante and Blake and figures like Eckhart and so on as well. Teresa of Avila too. Very, very different in one way. The Spanish mystics are so different from Meister Eckhart, so different from William Blake.
Yes.
Although actually Blake did say that friends of Blake said that he liked to quote Teresa of Avila. So there's perhaps more cross-referencing than we otherwise realise. But one of the things that in what you've been saying just now, I mean,
yes.
you described your experience when you were ill and this sustained sense of bliss and love for quite a period. And then, but is that at all related to, I think what you've also been saying is that when you encounter figures or texts, when they speak to you, it's like what the Jesuits would call, they offer consolation. And they offer, there's a sense of expansion or opening, or the presence of the truth draws you in. Whereas, a regular sort of just detective story or something might amuse you, but it's not going to open that sense of the heart. But is the way a text or a poem might speak to you related at all to the original experience that you described?
You'll have to just elaborate slightly more.
I'm wondering whether the experience you described when we
Yes.
started talking today, and which you opened your book with, does it feel now sort of exceptional? Or does the way that, say, Krishnamurti touches you, does it feel on a continuum? Is it part of the same spectrum, the warming of your heart, perhaps, or the ring of truth in Krishnamurti's words? Does that feel like what really came down upon you when you were meditating before?
I'm not sure, Mark, because the experience I had was so visceral and emotional in a way, that you can't really get that from. I haven't been able to get that from that same sort of experience from a book. I can recognize it. I think, strangely, the mystic that describes the experience I had most accurately is Simeon, the new theologian, the Orthodox monk. I think it was sort of early 11th century, as I recall. And he had an experience of being filled with light, and he calls it something like luminous water washing through him. And that was the most accurate description I've come across in terms of my own experience. But almost all the mystics I've come across have had something similar, and indeed more profound. And certainly they've been more articulate about those experiences. Krishnamurti himself went through an extended process of, I say process, he actually called it the process, where he'd go into these strange trances, which were very painful. They were like sort of giant migraines. and they could last for a couple of days, after which he emerged with a sort of an extraordinary clarity of perception and of thinking. And I think he described it as if he felt as if his brain was mutating physically. I don't know if it was or not. That's how he described it. And eventually he had a kind of an awakening in about something like 1922 in Ojai in California. And it sounded very, very similar to Gautama the Buddha. I think he was actually sitting by a tree, and there were two witnesses who could sort of actually feel a sense of light coming off him. And it sort of changed his personality as well. And I think that very much moved me to read that.
Who was that figure?
Krishnamurti.
That's Krishnamurti, right? Sorry,
yeah, that was Krishnamurti who had this experience.
Right? Yeah. No, I think unless I misheard you, I was still on Simeon the New Theologian, but you moved to
I beg your
Krishnamurti.
pardon.
Yeah,
I switched.
yeah, okay.
I may not have flagged that up. And Krishnamurti, I think one of his books, I think it's called Krishnamurti's Notebook. I've often wondered that if you did sort of have a sustained, a complete transformation and found enlightenment or unity of being, to use Yeats's phrase, what it would be like, how life would be. And I think what stops people from on the quest for enlightenment is the fear of attachment and of letting. I've known people who think that they will no longer love their spouses or their children in the same way, that they'll have this sort of mystical detachment from them, and it deters them. And Krishnamurti's Notebook seems to have been written at a point where he had achieved full enlightenment, to use a common word. And it's a fascinating book where he just describes mostly going for walks in the forest, his perceptions of nature. But you really do get an authentic sense of what it's like to perceive nature without any conditioning, without any intrusive voices. It's like the Japanese poet Matsuo Basho said once, that if you want to write about the bamboo, you have to become the bamboo. That there should be no mediating, conditioning fence. And Krishnamurti's Notebook seems to actually, I think it's about the only book I've come across where he seems to actually achieve that. Not that he was trying to achieve it, but that's just the way it comes out. So I found that very inspiring.
Well, thanks for sharing all that. The direct experience is very engaging, and I just wonder, drawing to a close, where you are now. You begin your book with the story of an awakening, and you've written the book in pursuit of what, I don't know, would you say what that might mean now in the another part of life? What has engaging with the mystics given you? Where do you find yourself now?
It's given me a huge amount, I think. I think writing about your mystical experiences, as you mentioned, Teresa, indeed Blake, of course, all of them, some of them more intimately than others. Some are on best behavior, Francis de Sales, for example. Others are more intimate, William Law. But it's a bit like, it's similar to poetry in as much as poets tend to give themselves away in their writing, and I think the mystics do, and not just their everyday lives, but the most intimate parts of their lives, the bits that they've found most transformational, like Blaise Pascal his moment of revelation where he just, he writes it down as something like joy, joy, fire, fire. You probably remember the quote.
Yeah, and sews it into his coat and
Goes
carries it
into his
around with
coat.
him. Yeah.
And so to get these little, small revelations from more than 70 mystics is a real privilege, really. And they're easy to find. I mean, a lot of them are in Penguin paperbacks. They're not, esoteric texts. And my book is a humble one, as much as it's a survey. I'm not pursuing theological arguments. It's more, I was curious to see how they fit in to the context of their times. So I put in historical context, so that it's important that we know when the Reformation happens, or the French Revolution, or when the Inquisition was happening. So yeah, it's been extraordinarily fascinating and moving at times as well, and especially William Blake. I love William Blake. I do a small little bit, like a sort of a tiny bit of DNA, which your book expands. It's like a Vesta paella, you pour
Yeah, I
water.
mean, I both when I've written about Blake and Dante, I try and stay as closely in touch with the inside story, if you like, as I can.
Yes.
Constantly asking myself, what's happening for them? Do I know that in myself? What kind of dynamic? I mean, Blake's famous metaphor is the golden string, and winding it
Yes.
into a ball. So I feel that that's what I'm doing when I read these figures, and then there's the ones that really speak to you. I mentioned the Cloud of Unknowing that I read again and again and again as a kind of
Yes.
Lectio Divina.
I wanted to ask you, Mark, though, Blake's double vision. Do you think that was a permanent state, or something that he could kind of switch on and off? Was it beyond his control, do you think, or it was just so part of him that he was almost unaware of it?
I think it was permanent. I think he lived with angels and saints and the dead every day. He himself says that sometimes it's a sense of presence, sometimes it's a figure in front of him. So I think it's not beyond his control. But on the other hand, I think he thought that we have to be active in relation to these visions, and that if you're passive, just sort of hanging around, waiting for them, you'll miss them, and also you'll miss the significance of them. And I think this is quite a common teaching, actually, whether it's an oracle or a visit of an angel, or there's a sense in which you have to say yes and to move towards, in order, because what's happening is that the vision is occurring in a kind of in between space. So I think that that's one of the things which I get out of Blake, is that it is an activity, not like playing tennis, but in sense of your own involvement. So that's how I would understand part of what Blake's teaching us. So it's not willed in the sense that he can sort of turn one direction and see things and turn another and not, but it calls forth his collaboration, and that can partly be practiced, I think. Yeah. But James, thanks so much for talking through these things.
Thank
And it's wonderful in your book to get the personal sense, but then how this can become a sort of project, and orientate our life. So thanks for talking.
Well, thank you, Mark, for giving me the opportunity to chat, and it's lovely to talk to you and find more out about Blake.